I'm 79 years old, and if you had asked me even 10 years ago what I feared the most, I would have told you without hesitation it was ending up alone. My name is Harold, and for most of my life, I believed that a full house meant a full life. Noise meant happiness. People meant purpose. Silence to me felt like something was missing, like a warning sign that something had gone wrong. But life has a quiet way of proving you wrong, not all at once, but slowly, patiently, until one day you wake up and realize the very thing you were afraid of has been quietly saving you. I've been living alone for the past 11 years. My wife Eleanor passed away after nearly 5 decades together. We built a life the way people used to, steady, predictable, centered around family. We had 2 children, a son and a daughter, both grown now with families of their own. For years, my identity was tied to being a husband, a father, a provider. I worked as a railway clerk for most of my life, waking up at the same hour every morning, catching the same train, returning home to the same routine. There was comfort in that rhythm, but there was also something else I never noticed at the time: how little of that life was actually mine. After Eleanor died, the house didn't just become quiet, it became unfamiliar. The ticking clock sounded louder, the walls felt wider, even the furniture seemed out of place, like it didn't know what to do without her. My children visited often in the beginning. They worried, of course. They'd sit with me at the dining table, speaking in softer voices, asking questions they already knew the answers to. Are you okay? Do you feel lonely? Do you want to come stay with us? And every time I could see it in their eyes, they thought I was fragile, like something inside me might break if I was left alone too long. I believed them at first. I thought something was wrong with me for sitting in silence. So I tried to fix it. I filled my days with things I didn't care about, joined a local club where I barely spoke, accepted invitations just to avoid saying no, turned the television on first thing in the morning and left it running until I went to bed. Not because I was watching, but because I didn't want to hear the silence. It felt heavy, like it was pressing in on me, forcing me to feel things I wasn't ready to feel. But something strange started to happen after a while. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just small shifts that I almost didn't notice. One morning I woke up later than usual. No alarm, no schedule, no reason to rush. I just lay there for a few minutes listening. The house wasn't loud, but it wasn't suffocating either. It was calm. I got up slowly, made myself a cup of tea, and sat by the window. No television, no radio, just me, the light coming in through the glass, and the quiet hum of the world outside. That was the first time I felt it, that something about being alone wasn't entirely negative. It was different, yes, unfamiliar, but not empty. For most of my life, I had never asked myself what I actually liked. That might sound strange, but when you spend decades adjusting yourself around other people, you stop noticing your own preferences. I woke up when work demanded it, not when my body was ready. I ate when meals were expected, not when I was hungry. Even the smallest things, like what to watch on television or how to spend a Sunday afternoon, were always a compromise, a quiet negotiation between needs and expectations. Living alone changed that in ways I never expected. I started noticing things about myself that had always been there but never had space to exist. I realized I preferred mornings, not rushed, not structured, morning slow ones. I liked sitting with my tea while the day was still waking up. I liked the way the light moved across the floor, the way the air felt cooler before the sun fully settled in. For years, mornings had been something to get through quickly. Now, they became something I looked forward to. I also noticed I didn't miss the constant conversations I thought I needed. In fact, I realized I had spent much of my life talking just to fill space. Small talk, polite exchanges, conversations that didn't go anywhere but felt necessary at the time. Without that expectation, I found something surprising. I preferred fewer words. Not silence out of loneliness, but silence that allowed thoughts to breathe. I began taking walks in the late afternoon, not for exercise, not because anyone told me to, but because I wanted to. There was a small park not far from my house, one I had passed by for years without ever really seeing. Now I walked through it slowly, noticing things I would have ignored before. The way leaves moved in the wind, the sound of distant traffic blending with birdsong, children laughing somewhere in the background. These were small things, insignificant perhaps, but they grounded me in a way I hadn't felt in years. And as the days turned into months, I started to understand something that had never been clear to me before. Being alone wasn't taking something away from me. It was giving me something. I had never had space to be exactly who I was, without adjustment, without performance, without the quiet pressure of meeting someone else's expectations. There was no one to tell me when to eat, so I ate when I was hungry. Some days that meant lunch at noon, other days at 3. Dinner became simpler, sometimes just a bowl of soup or a piece of toast, but it was enough. Not because it met some standard, but because it met my needs. I went to bed when I felt tired, not when the day said I should. I woke up when my body was ready, not when an alarm demanded it. These changes might seem small from the outside, almost insignificant, but to me, they felt like reclaiming something I didn't even know I had lost. For the first time in my life, I wasn't adjusting myself to fit into a life. I was allowing life to adjust around me. There's a kind of quiet freedom in that, one that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't come with excitement or celebration. It comes slowly, in moments you barely notice until they've already changed you. And once you feel it, even briefly, you begin to understand that maybe, just maybe, being alone isn't something to fear. It's something to learn from. As the months passed, that quiet freedom I had begun to notice didn't fade the way I expected it to. If anything, it deepened, settled into something steadier, something that felt less like a phase and more like a new way of living. But along with that freedom came something else I hadn't prepared for. The silence, which had once felt peaceful in small doses, began to stretch into longer periods, and with it came thoughts I had spent years avoiding. When you live with others, especially for as long as I had, there is always a kind of distraction available. Even in the most ordinary moments, there's something external to focus on: someone speaking, something happening, a task that needs attention. But alone, there is no escape from your own mind. It sits with you, quietly at first, then more persistently, bringing up memories, questions, regrets. I remember one evening in particular. It was raining outside, the kind of steady, gentle rain that taps softly against the windows. I was sitting in my chair with nothing on, no television, no music, just the sound of the rain and the ticking clock behind me. And for the first time, I allowed myself to think about my life without distraction. Not the version of my life I told others, not the simplified stories, the real one. I thought about my years with Eleanor, about how much we had shared, but also how much we had never said. We had been good partners, dependable, committed, but there were parts of me she never really knew, not because she didn't care, but because I never offered them. I had spent so much of my life playing a role husband, father, provider that I forgot there was more to me than those roles. And then I thought about my children. I had always believed I was a good father. I provided for them, kept a roof over their heads, made sure they had what they needed. But sitting there in that quiet room, I realized something uncomfortable. I had been present, but not always truly there. I had been busy, focused, responsible, but not always attentive. There were moments I had missed, conversations I hadn't had, things I assumed would always be there waiting for me. That realization didn't come with drama. There were no tears, no sudden breakdown, just a quiet understanding that settled in my chest and stayed there. A recognition that time doesn't pause for you to catch up later. It moves forward whether you're paying attention or not. For a while, that awareness made the silence feel heavy again. Not in the way it had in the beginning, but differently. Before, the silence had felt like emptiness. Now it felt like a mirror. It reflected things back to me I couldn't ignore. There were days I considered going back to the way things were before filling my time again, surrounding myself with noise, avoiding those thoughts. It would have been easy. The television was still there. The invitation still came, even if less frequently now. I could have stepped back into that busy, distracted version of living and never had to sit with those realizations again. But something in me resisted that. Not out of strength, but out of a quiet understanding that if I turned away now, I would be turning away from something important. So instead, I stayed with it. I let the silence do what it needed to do. And slowly something began to change again. The thoughts that had once felt overwhelming started to organize themselves. What had been a flood of regrets turned into something more manageable, more specific. I began to see patterns, to understand not just what I had done, but why I had done it. The choices I made weren't random. They were shaped by fear, by expectation, by the belief that being responsible meant putting everything else aside. I had spent so much of my life thinking that being needed was the same as being fulfilled, that if I did what was expected of me, everything else would take care of itself. But sitting there alone, I realized that wasn't entirely true. There is a difference between living a life that looks complete and actually feeling complete within it. That distinction became clearer in the way I started to handle my days. I stopped trying to fill every hour with something productive. For most of my life, idleness had felt like failure. If I wasn't doing something useful, I felt like I was wasting time. But now I began to question that belief. Who was I being useful for? And why did every moment need to serve a purpose beyond simply being lived? One afternoon, I sat outside longer than usual. I wasn't thinking about anything important. I wasn't solving a problem or making a plan. I was just sitting, watching the shadows shift as the sun moved across the sky. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty about it. That was new. It might sound insignificant, but it wasn't. That small moment marked a shift in how I understood time. It didn't always need to be filled, managed, or justified. Sometimes it could just be experienced. Around that same time, I began to notice changes in how I interacted with others. My children still called, still visited, but something about those interactions felt different now. In the beginning, I had clung to those moments, stretched them out, tried to make them last longer than they naturally would. I didn't want them to leave because their presence felt like a temporary solution to the silence. But as I grew more comfortable with being alone, that need started to fade. I didn't feel the same urgency to hold on to every conversation. I listened more, spoke less, not because I had nothing to say, but because I no longer felt the need to fill every pause. And interestingly, those conversations became better. There was less pressure, less unspoken expectation. When my daughter visited, we didn't rush to fill the time. Sometimes we would sit quietly for a few minutes, and it didn't feel awkward. It felt natural. When we spoke, it was more direct, more honest. I wasn't trying to present myself as someone who needed reassurance. I was just being myself. That shift extended beyond my family. I started noticing that the fewer interactions I had, the more meaningful they became. I spoke to a man at the park one afternoon. We had seen each other there several times, always nodding politely but never speaking. That day we started talking. Nothing significant at first, just small observations about the weather, the neighborhood, but then the conversation deepened slowly, naturally. We talked for nearly an hour. And when it ended, I didn't feel drained the way I used to after long conversations. I felt satisfied, not because the conversation was extraordinary, but because it was real. There was no obligation, no expectation, just two people choosing to share a moment. That was when I began to understand something that had never been clear to me before. When you are not afraid of being alone, you stop seeking people out of need. And when you stop needing people to fill a gap, the connections you do form become something entirely different. They become choices, and there is a quiet strength in that, a kind of independence that doesn't isolate you, but frees you from the pressure of constant companionship. Of course, this shift didn't happen all at once. There were still days when the silence felt heavier than usual. Days when memories surfaced unexpectedly, when the absence of familiar voices felt more noticeable. But those moments didn't carry the same weight they once did. They came and they passed, like everything else, because by then I had started to understand something deeper about being alone. It wasn't about removing loneliness completely. It was about changing your relationship with it. It took me longer than I would like to admit to understand that last part. For most of my life, I believed loneliness was something to avoid at all costs, something that meant you had failed in some quiet personal way. But sitting in that same chair, in that same quiet house, day after day, I began to see that loneliness wasn't a permanent state. It was something that came and went like weather. And more importantly, it was something that changed depending on how I chose to meet it. There were mornings when I woke up and felt its presence immediately, a kind of heaviness in the room, a reminder that there was no one else in the house, no footsteps in the hallway, no voice calling out from another room, just me. But instead of running from that feeling the way I used to, I started to sit with it. Not because I enjoyed it, but because I was beginning to understand it. And what I discovered surprised me. Loneliness wasn't always about the absence of people. Sometimes it was about the absence of connection with others, yes, but also with yourself. For years, I had been surrounded by people, yet there were moments when I felt more alone than I did sitting in that quiet house. Back then, I didn't have the words for it. I just assumed something was missing and tried to fill it with more activity, more responsibility, more noise. But now in the stillness, I could see it more clearly. I started paying attention to the difference between being alone and feeling lonely. They are not the same, though people use them as if they are. Being alone is a physical condition. Feeling lonely is an emotional one, and the two don't always arrive together. There were afternoons when I was completely alone and felt perfectly content. I would sit by the window with a book I wasn't even reading, just holding it in my lap, watching the world move slowly outside. A dog passing by with its owner, a bicycle rolling down the street, the wind shifting the leaves on the trees. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth telling anyone about. And yet, in those moments, I felt full. Not in a loud or overwhelming way, but in a quiet, steady sense that everything was exactly as it needed to be. And then there were other moments, less frequent now, when loneliness would return. Not as sharply as before, but enough to remind me it was still there. When that happened, I didn't try to cover it up. I didn't turn on the television immediately or reach for the phone just to hear a voice. Instead, I would ask myself a simple question: what is this feeling asking for? Sometimes the answer was connection. Real connection, not distraction. On those days, I would call my daughter, not to fill silence, but to share something genuine, a thought I had, something I noticed on my walk, a memory that came back to me. And because I wasn't calling out of desperation, the conversation felt different, lighter, more honest. Other times, the answer wasn't another person at all. It was something within me that needed attention, a thought I had been avoiding, a memory I hadn't fully processed. And in those moments, being alone became an opportunity instead of a burden, a chance to understand myself a little better. I began to trust that I could handle both states, the calm of being alone and the occasional ache of loneliness. Neither one defined me completely. They were just parts of the same experience. That trust changed something fundamental in me. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I needed to hold on to people out of fear. I loved my children, I appreciated my friends, but I no longer felt that quiet panic underneath it all, the sense that if they weren't there, something essential would be missing. I knew now that I could sit in an empty room and still feel whole. That realization didn't make me distant. It made me more present. When my son visited, I listened more carefully to what he was saying, not just the words, but the pauses in between. When my daughter laughed, I noticed it fully, without my mind already worrying about when the moment would end. Because I wasn't trying to preserve the moment out of fear, I could actually experience it while it was happening. And when they left, I didn't feel that sharp drop I used to feel. The house became quiet again, yes, but the quiet no longer felt like something had been taken away. It felt like a return to something familiar, something I had learned to appreciate. In that space, I began to notice something else I had missed for most of my life, me own company. I had spent decades believing that being comfortable alone meant something was wrong, that it meant you had given up on connection or withdrawn from the world. But what I found was the opposite. The more comfortable I became with myself, the more open I was to the world around me. I started doing small things without overthinking them, sitting outside longer than planned, taking a different route on my walks just to see where it led, cooking a meal I had never tried before, even if it didn't turn out well. There was no one to impress, no standard to meet, just the simple act of living. And in those small, ordinary moments, I found something I had been searching for without realizing Eda's sense of ease. Not excitement, not constant happiness, but ease. The kind that settles in your chest and stays there quietly without demanding attention. The kind that allows you to move through your day without feeling like you're missing something. If I could go back and speak to the man I was years ago, the one who feared this kind of life, I wouldn't try to convince him with arguments or explanations. I would simply tell him this: the thing you're afraid of is not what you think it is. Being alone will not break you. It will show you things about yourself you never had time to see. It will ask you questions you have been avoiding. It will give you more space than you know what to do with at first. And yes, at times it will feel uncomfortable. But if you stay with it, if you allow it to unfold instead of resisting it, it will also give you something else. It will give you yourself. And that is not something to take lightly. Now, at 79, I don't feel like I am waiting for something better to come along. I don't feel like this is a temporary chapter that needs to be replaced. This is my life exactly as it is, and for the first time I am living it without trying to reshape it into something else. I still miss Eleanor. That hasn't changed, and I don't expect it ever will. But the absence of one person did not erase the possibility of a full life. It simply changed the shape of it. And in that new shape, I found something I didn't expect. Not just peace, but acceptance. A quiet understanding that being alone is not something to fix. It is something to learn from, something to experience, and sometimes, if you allow it, something to be grateful for. So if you ever find yourself in a quiet room wondering what comes next, don't rush to fill it. Sit there for a while. Let the silence settle. Let your thoughts rise and fall without chasing them away. You might discover, the way I did, that nothing is missing. You are simply meeting yourself for the first time.